Hey guys, it is Melissa and welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Melissa Ellen and I do true crime videos. My intention is to raise awareness. I want to help out with unsolved cases, missing persons, and then I also just want to talk about crazy true crime stories. And I want to always try to pay respect to the victims, and that is obviously of the utmost importance. But I think in some of these cases, they're really far away from when they happened, and they're just so made for TV that it's very hard to be as serious as I would normally like to be. I try. So we're going to talk about a more creepy, spooky, whatever case because it happened on Halloween night, and it is known as the trick-or-treat murder. And there are some YouTube videos that do cover this case, and they're pretty good. I mean, here's the deal. The case happened back in 1950, and so there's a very long time span, and the reported facts are really funky. And I think that's because there is a source online that gives you a lot of info, but that particular source happens to be wrong from what I found when actually going into actual like digging. And so unfortunately, if you hear some of the things that I'm going to say and you think, man, somebody else said something different, just remember at the end of the day, it wasn't that important. And it's not the purpose. And I can tell you right now that I did do my research. So if I'm wrong, I apologize. But I really don't think I am. I don't think so anyways, not in this one. So thank you guys so much for being here. And if you like true crime, you like to hear things like this, make sure you hit the subscribe button down below. I can't thank you guys enough because we are about to hit 5,000. So I don't know, it's just, I appreciate it. So let's jump right into the video, guys. Okay, so this happened in 1957, and we're going to be talking about a man by the name of Peter Fabiano. Now, Peter Fabiano was married to Betty, and he had two stepchildren that were Betty's children. Now, so here's kind of what I gathered. Betty was kind of doing well. She was working as a beauty operator, so a hairdresser, and a little bit of confusion, but she might have already owned a salon or she was gonna own a salon. And so she seemed to be doing pretty well in life, and she met Peter. Peter had worked as a truck driver, but he had a lot of skills, and they got together, and Betty recommended to Peter that he go and get his hair operators. I can't remember. I was trying to Google the term, but yeah, he was going to become a hairdresser as well. And so once he did this, they got together and he used his GI Bill to fund them opening a salon. So there was I saw some of the videos that were like, how in the world did this happen? But apparently that's what happened. This is what she was already doing. They got together. He had his GI Bill and he was able to use his GI Bill to pay for them opening their salon. So apparently they opened their salons in Hollywood and they were doing really well. They were very successful. I wouldn't say that they were like major celebrities, but they were prominent members of the community. So Peter and Betty are living together. They're married. They have these salons. Things are going really well. And they're living in their home in Sun Valley, which is like in the LA area. So it's Halloween night, October 31st of 1957. And at this time, they've gone to bed. It's already 11 o'clock at night. They've handed out candy. Their daughter, it would be Peter's stepdaughter and Betty's daughter, had retired and already gone to bed. Their son, again, her son, his stepson, had already left. Like apparently he was returning to the naval base in San Diego, so he had already returned and wasn't there. So they're all in bed. It's 11 o'clock at night, and there's a knock at the door. And Betty kind of is like, hey, you're gonna get the door, and Peter is like not wanting to get the door, but eventually, there's a ring. I guess it was a door, ring the doorbell, and then a knock at the door. So they decided, okay, fine, it's just some kids. They really want candy. So Peter decides, and he goes to the front door, and he gets there, and he's like, opens the door, and he sees what appears to be someone in a costume, and he's like, okay, fine, and he says, isn't it a little late for this? The person says no, and then raises a bag and shoots Peter at this point, and then left the scene. So Betty hears the shot, and she and her daughter Judy was 15 years old, and I just don't want to go into too much details about a minor at the time. So her name was Judy, and she goes with her mother as well, and they go to the front door, and they find that Peter has been shot. At this time, the 15-year-old daughter calls the police. Betty remembers that there is a member of the police department that lives 2 houses down. So she runs down to get that person, tells them what's going on. They call law enforcement, and law enforcement arrives at the home immediately. And they are unable to save Peter, and Peter Fabiano did pass away at that time. So now they're asking Betty what happened. And she's explaining to them that we thought it was trick-or-treaters and went to the door. And let me be very clear, though. She didn't really explain, like, that was about all the information they got out of her, because this is the 1950s. So I'm only smirking at this part. It is the 1950s. It's freezing in here. It is the 1950s, and it was very common to sedate people if they were having any sort of an episode. So the fact that she was grieving and crying, she was sedated medically for several days. So that's really all the information they got. She was able to tell them at some point that it seemed like there were 2 people at the door, and one sounded like a man and one sounded like a woman trying to sound like a man. I could not find what was being said, because the only quotes that I found that were said was, "Don't you think it's a little late?" And the person said no. But I couldn't find the quote of what else the people were saying for her to be hearing them to know what they sounded like. So Betty is sedated. She comes around, and now police are interviewing her. I believe it was Judy was able to supply that a car sped off from the scene immediately after the shooting. And so that's all they were able to get, was that a car sped off. So they're talking to Betty, and they're asking her, like, do you know anyone that would have a problem with your husband? And everything she could find is no. So they went back and they like really dug into Peter's like life and his criminal record or anything that they could find. And the only thing they found is that I think it was like 10 years prior, he had been accused of being a bookie. And they're like, that just doesn't really equate to what we're dealing with. So then they try to look at motives, and obviously robbery wasn't a motive because nothing was taken and they left the scene immediately at a high rate of speed trying to get away. It just, nothing was making sense. So, of course they come back to Betty and they're like, hey, we need you to think harder. Is there anyone you can think of? And the only person she could think of was a prior employee at the salon and a friend by the name of Joan. Now, Joan had worked at the salon prior, and apparently she had been terminated. And so they brought Joan in and they interviewed her. They're just looking for anyone that could possibly be involved. And they interview her and they kind of go through everything. And she said, no, I was at home when this happened. I for sure did not leave. There was someone who said they knew for sure because her car didn't leave the driveway, or because she didn't have a car, so she couldn't have left. Just so you know, that was a clarification that was out there. So one or the other, either she didn't have a car, so she couldn't have left her house and she was at home, or her car was in the driveway the whole time, so she couldn't have left her house. Okay, so it's one of those, right? And so she's like, look, I'm not involved. And police interview her, go through her alibi, go through everything, and they decide that she's not involved, and they release her. And so then now they're like, what are we going to do now? And they're trying to figure out, like, okay, who could this possibly be? Because nobody's coming up as a viable suspect. I believe it was a month after the incident happened, the police received a confidential tip that they needed to go look in a storage locker at a department store. So then, of course, police decide to go and check out the storage locker at this department store. When they get there, they find that there is a .38 caliber pistol in the storage locker, and it is the gun that killed Peter. So they're like, okay, what's going on here? So they research into the storage locker and find out that a woman by the name of Goldyne had actually rented the storage locker. They look back at Goldyne and they're looking at her history to see how she's in any way connected to this case, and they can't find anything. They're like, what is going on? So they bring Goldyne in after they've already done some digging, trying to figure out why she could be involved so they can better question her, and they have nothing. So they bring her in and they're like, hi, do you know anything? And she's like, yeah, I do. I did it. And it's a relief to get this off my chest. I did. And I say it that way because I just want you guys to get kind of the impact that that's literally how it happened. Like they had nothing. They brought her in and she's like, yeah, I did it. Okay, so that's great, right? Because that it is a wonderful thing. That's exactly what we want to happen. So she gets in there. And so police are, of course, why? How do you even know him? And basically she explains, well, I don't know him. I had never met him. And I didn't even know what he looked like. But I did it for Joan. Remember Joan? Okay. So here is a little bit of background with Joan. Joan worked at the salon. Now, Joan was described as a tall woman. And this is the 1950s. Did you know in California that it was absolutely illegal to be gay? Totally illegal. So the phrasing that were used in the newspapers back then, I mean, they're absurd and they're totally rude and wrong, but it's like it's so long ago that it's absolutely hilarious. The way that this woman was described, it's just, yeah. Basically what they're saying is that she was a little on the masculine side and she seemed to be into women. I mean, right? It's like a big deal. Who cares? Anyways, but back then it was a big deal. I'm not exactly sure where Joan was from originally. I had heard she was from Lebanon. I'm not really sure. But eventually she ended up in Hawaii where she went to school, and she was a writer and a freelance photographer. So Peter hired her to work in one of her salons, and I don't know if she was just as an odd job or if she was doing some sort of photography for him or what she was doing there. But while working there, it seemed that Peter and Joan started having an issue with each other. And there's a lot of questions why, and nobody's ever really going to know why. But it is known that Betty and Joan became good friends. So they're both owners of the salon, and he doesn't like her, and she becomes friends with him. Or the theory more goes to she became friends with Joan, like Betty and Joan became friends, and Peter didn't like her because of that. Because Joan is known to like women. But he hired her, so like maybe he didn't know before. So I don't know if he really had, nobody knows why he had a problem with her. But eventually something did happen and he ended up terminating Joan. And it was apparently kind of a public thing. It happened in the salon, and he terminates Joan and he tells Betty, like, you're not talking to her anymore. And at this time, just so we're not like, like every woman in the comments, I tell him, no, I do whatever I want. But like at the time, it would have been absolutely believable and acceptable for her to just say, okay, but she didn't. She said, no, that's my friend and I'm going to stay friends with her. Which leads to more people wondering, like, it is so uncommon in this time to have a woman tell her husband no about such a big deal. It wasn't like, what color shoes to wear. Like, it's a big deal. And so for her to say no to him and go against him makes you wonder, was it because she was a woman ahead of her time, which, A1, or was it because she might have started to have feelings for Joan? There's a lot of questions about that. And you're not going to get a lot of info back then in like the news articles because they referred to it as a possible inappropriate relationship. And so apparently this like causes even more issues between Peter and Betty. And at some point, Betty moves out of her home and goes to stay with Joan for about a month. So now even more questions like, and yeah, we're going to get to Goldie, I promise. Okay. But we got to talk about Joan and why Joan orchestrated this. And so at some point she had went to stay with her, but she returned home to her husband. And it's unknown what the real reason was that she returned home to her husband. Did she truly intend to work things out with him? Was this just an argument over who she could be friends with? Did she try to enter into a new relationship with a woman and decide that it wasn't going to work for her? I can imagine how difficult that would be because Joan was a divorcee, just like Betty, but she didn't have children. And so she was making these decisions about her life that were considered like a major big deal back then. But like she was making them by herself. And I just wonder if Betty didn't know what to do. And I don't think that it was a matter, maybe it was, but I don't get this. But I don't get it that Peter was like controlling her and she was so miserable and she was trying to escape. And I didn't get the impression that, she went back to him because he made her. It didn't seem that that was the relationship they had. And money didn't seem to be a factor, because we're going to talk about all of that in a minute. But it appeared from when I dug in, it didn't seem that Betty wasn't already financially able to take care of herself. And so I don't think she would return just so that Peter could support her. I mean, they own this, I don't know, but it was back then. I don't think it's like, 50-50, it's mine too. I don't think it was like that back then. So once Betty did return home to live with Peter, Peter did have one rule, and that was that he didn't want to hear Joan's name again. There was none. No Joan, she doesn't exist. You're not seeing her. You're not even talking about her. And Betty agreed to this. So for whatever reason, she agreed to absolutely no contact with Joan. It appears at this point, Joan was angry or jealous or just whatever. And so that's when Joan hatched a plan. And her plan was to get Goldie to go kill Peter for her. That way she wouldn't go to prison, and assumptively, then she could have Betty to herself. So she goes to Goldie and she tells Goldie that basically Peter is this horrible, 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 evil, vile man. He's abusive, he's controlling, he's just the epitome of everything you picture bad in a person. So Joan goes to Goldie. Now, Goldie was someone that she had known for a very long time. And Goldie was described as being meek and small and shy. Actually, there was a quote from an article, and I couldn't find it, so I have to say it. And I'm probably going to find it as soon as I say this, because I couldn't find it earlier. But in a podcast I was listening to, amazing podcast. I'm going to put it up for you guys. It was so good. But in the podcast, they were talking about, in an article, they described Goldyne as 43 years old, but still pretty. Wow. Things were so different. Still pretty, at 43. Wow. So obviously Goldie is interviewed by, doctors and lawyers and everyone, and they all pretty much seem to agree, from what I found, that she was just someone who didn't really have a lot of her own opinions. So once they agreed that they were going to do this, Joan gave Goldyne money to buy a .38 pistol. Apparently they went to the store. Goldyne told the man behind the counter that she needed it for home protection. And then they were going to get the gun. And I think they had to go back, and they did go back and get the gun. But Joan took Goldyne, gave her the money, but Goldyne is the one who purchased it and put it in her name. So then they decide that they're going to take care of this. And I believe Goldyne kept the gun with her, and then Joan picked her up. Joan didn't have a car, or did have a car. I don't know if she had a car or not, but she picked Joan up in a borrowed car. So when Joan had came in, she said, for sure it couldn't have been me, because either my car didn't move or I don't have a car. But they found out from a neighbor down the way from Joan that Joan had actually borrowed the neighbor's car. Now, she told the neighbor she needed to go pick up some groceries, and the neighbor said that was fine, let her borrow the car. Now, I don't know if the neighbor was like checking her, or if this was just something the neighbor did, but the neighbor actually kept a note or wrote it down of the miles that were driven that night in her car. And they were more than the miles that it should have been for her to go and get groceries. So when Joan showed up over to Goldyne's house in the borrowed car, she had already had items for them to wear. It was like khaki jackets and jeans and glasses and makeup. I don't know what the costume was going to be, but they were dressed up in a way. And they were going to head over there and pretend to be trick-or-treaters. Goldyne said that they arrived at the Fabiano's home around 9 p.m. and they just sat and waited for the lights to go out. Eventually, the lights in the house did go out, and Goldyne went up to the door. She said that what she did was she went up to the door, she rang the doorbell, nobody answered, so she knocked, and that she had the gun in a bag, and that when the door was opened, she lifted the gun with both hands and aimed it at Peter Fabiano and shot him. What happened after that is that Goldyne then ran back to the car. She got into the borrowed car with Joan. Joan drove them back to the neighbor's house. They dropped the car off there, left it on the street, and then they were going to leave and go in their separate directions. Goldyne was completely surprised when Joan turned around and said, forget you ever saw me. And that just completely shocked her because Goldyne thought that they were connected now, that like they were going to be together, because Goldyne also wanted to be in an inappropriate relationship. Abnormal. That's what they called it. Abnormal. Not inappropriate. Abnormal. It was called an abnormal. That was kind of like the newspaper's way of saying they're gay, is abnormal. So Joan was a lesbian and Goldyne was a lesbian, and Goldyne thought, hello, we're together. Like, I just did something for you. And on top of that, like, I would assume that we were going to be together, since you're like, why would you ask me to do this if we're not together? And so Goldyne was very upset by that. The question comes in on who called police with the anonymous tip. And so you want to know that, and you are thinking maybe it was Betty. There was talk about possibilities that Betty could have been involved in this triangle, because Joan's obvious intention was to get to Betty. I mean, I don't think she would have went through all of this trouble and told all these stories to Goldyne and put so much into it because she was fired or let go or because she didn't like him. I mean, this was obviously, they took 3 months. 3 months planning this murder. Like, planning. That takes serious passion and serious feelings, because I'm not saying people regularly walk around and think for a day that they're going to kill someone and then change their mind later. But like, if you didn't have that much invested into it, you would have like talked yourself out of it in a 3-month period. But obviously this was something they all, according to Goldyne, this was like all they talked about, all that was on Joan's mind. She just wanted to get rid of Peter because he was harming Betty. He was harming people. He was a bad, bad man. So obviously, Joan had feelings for Betty. That is the only thing that makes sense. Were her feelings reciprocated? Nobody will ever really know that for sure. But what we do know is at the time this had happened, Betty was with her husband, and that appeared to be where she wanted to be at that time. If she had set this all up, according to what has been researched and found, they would have had to have planned this way back. And then she would have had to go back to him, and they would have like no contact for this whole time, like a very lengthy period of time. I mean, maybe they could have snuck contact, but not really. There's no cell phones and, text messages and all of that. Like, there would have had to have been a lot of like secret planning without anybody knowing for Betty to be involved in this plot. And it would have had to known that, Joan was going to be able to talk Goldyne into doing it. And like that, there's just a lot of things in motion. Police never felt that Betty was involved. They felt that she was extremely distraught when she found her husband. She was sedated as a result of that. But again, that's hard to use that as a judgment because they sedated a lot of people for a lot of reasons back then. But that does seem to be a thing. However, there is one thing that bothered me about Betty. And I'm not saying bless this woman's heart. I mean, she lost her husband. I'm just going to say it because it's just interesting. And I'm sure we would have a clarification if I could find it, but I can't find it. She mentioned that she heard 2 people at the door. One was a man and one sounded like a woman trying to sound like a man. So I'm just curious, like, did she hear Peter's voice? But I thought she could hear what he said. And then Goldyne's voice, or were they both at the door? That was just a little interesting to me because I couldn't find where somebody actually said for sure what the clarification was. So if you guys have it, because I might be a little tired at this point, comment down below because I was kind of curious about that. So because that's what, when I heard that in a podcast I was listening to, my brain was like, wait, everything says that only Goldyne went to the door. Actually, what everything says is that Goldyne went to the door and Joan drove them away, but nothing ever says they both went to the door and then they both got in the car. So it's kind of left for us to assume. So at this point, The police now know that Goldyne is responsible. She is the one who purchased the gun. She is the one who fired the gun. And she's admitted how she got to the scene and everything. And now she is saying that Joan was involved. Joan was arrested, and Joan has never gave a statement in regards. I'm sure she's told a little bit to police, but there is nothing out there. She was completely silent. She pled not guilty, as did Goldyne, eventually did plead not guilty. And that was all over the headlines. They're claiming innocence, but I mean, like, they pled not guilty so they could work things out. They did eventually take a plea deal. There was pleas of insanity. There was a lot going on, and the way that things were tried were a little bit different. So they did a plea deal, and the plea deal was 5 years. This sparked major problems. Treatment of women was a big one that was brought up. These two women murdered a man in cold blood. And it was a crime of passion and just purely horrible. And on Halloween, a holiday, this is a moment. You used a child's innocence of being able to knock on a stranger's door, and you turned the stranger into a victim. And it's such a trust thing that we do on Halloween, that we open our doors to strangers openly, and that it's not going to not be on my mind in 2 days. I already know. Like, every time I open the door, I'm going to be like, please don't. So yeah, I have a hatred for people who like harm anything that has to do with like how children grow and how we mold, and like taking anything innocent away. Like, that's like going around killing people wearing a Santa suit. Like, don't do that. That's mean. That's like what I equate it with. Like, it's wrong. It's like children's, yeah. Anyways, so they did their 5 years. Now, Goldyne, she did pass away, I believe, at the age of 83. She ended up living out her life, working in a women's center. I don't know. I mean, she murdered a man. I'm just grateful that she wasn't a problem to society going forward. At the end of the day, our intention is to punish and keep people off the streets who are going to harm people, right? I mean, like, if somebody's running around harming people, you don't want them running around, so you want to keep them contained. And so, I mean, I guess if she never harmed anyone again, then I guess it's fine, but it shouldn't be that way, because society should have never been at risk, and she should have been in prison, and she should have at least received a lengthy enough punishment. Like, your punishment of 5 years isn't even long enough, yet alone rehabilitation and making sure they're not going to repeat offend and all of that. There is literally no info on Joan. I'm going to include a podcast for you guys. I mentioned it, 3 times now, because it was so good. And there's some good videos too. I'll include those for you guys as well. But this podcast, I really liked it. It was my first time listening to them, and I like it. They mentioned, and this is just totally a possibility, and I was trying to find it, but they were really good. And they found an obituary, possibly of Joan's brother from 1997. That might have been her. It seemed to match based on where they were born and where they lived. And it said he had a surviving sister. So as of 1997, she might have still been alive, but she probably is not any longer at this time. Again, so no info. She could have changed her name. There were people who said that they thought she died in prison. But again, there's just no confirmation of that. So as for Betty, from what has been found, she did not remarry, but she did move forward with her life as well as her children, and bless their heart. I mean, she lost her husband, her children lost their stepfather, and that's just a really sad. And just to have it happen in that way, it doesn't make it any easier when you lose someone. It does make it sting less when it's not in such a brutal way. And I just, I always feel for that, and I always want to make sure that I let you guys know that it is about the victim. So again, thank you guys for hanging in here with me. It's 1 o'clock in the morning. So I'm tired. I love you guys. I'm going to start editing this and get it out for you hopefully tomorrow. Do me a favor, guys. Hug your babies, hug your loves. Life is literally precious. Enjoy every minute of every day. Don't take anything for granted. You just never know. So I love you guys, and I'll see you in my next video.